We come to the second part of this presentation, sex on Sabbath, a sin. From a New Testament perspective, we'll look at what causes defilement, spatial encounter with divinity. In other words, where God determines as his place of residence. And also, we focus on Paul's treatment on sex in devotion to prayer. It is important to understand this concept because prayer is a form of divine encounter. So Paul teaches that when one is devoted to prayer, one should abstain from sex in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We'll try to understand Paul and make a conclusion. So stay tuned and invite your friends, your family, your church, and the world as you share this message with them all. Like this page, leave a comment, and it will respond. Thank you very much for being a member of Bible Talk class. Have a wonderful time with us today. Let's begin the part 2 on sex on Sabbath, a sin. What is the issue again? The obvious question is, what is the New Testament take on the issue of sex on the Sabbath? In other words, is it a sin to have sex on the Sabbath? This presentation is going to be very simple. We're focusing mainly on Pauline writing. But before then, let's try to appreciate what defilement is in the New Testament. While the Old Testament focuses on limited spaces of God's presence, for example, the tabernacle in particular, the New Testament widens the scope of God's presence. When you read John chapter 4, verse 23, Jesus says that God is spirit, and therefore he can be worshipped anywhere. Now, so the defilement of God's presence is redefined in terms of practicing evil or act not in conformity with God's will. We have to understand that because in the New Testament we are told by Jesus that God is spirit and that he doesn't limit himself to a particular space to be recognized, to be worshipped as the creator, the redeemer. He can be found anywhere. He sees us wherever we may find ourselves, and that practicing evil or committing acts not in conformity with his will be seen as defiling his name. It is important to do that, defiling his name. And that point is noted as you read these references here. Now, a clear and a specific example is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 18 to 19, NIV. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. So this text teaches that the whole saved body belongs to God, and therefore we should honor him with the body. Now, what is interesting is that the author narrows the sin that, when committed, actually, defiles the entire body, because there's that union that is initiated when sexual intercourse is performed, and Jesus is in us. The Holy Spirit is in us. This whole body is seen as the temple. So the Old Testament space where God lived and didn't want people to defile with their natural and unnatural defilements. Here we come to the body, human body, as the temple. And this metaphor is very important. You must understand that. So the whole body is a temple of God. Let's appreciate what Jesus also teaches here. Jesus taught that a believer can approach God anywhere, including the temple, because he is spirit. The quality
of God is that he is a spiritual being and that he can be approached anywhere. And that's why Jesus goes on to say in Matthew chapter 6, verse 6, that, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen, because he is spirit. He's a spiritual being. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Your Father will be where you are. Already we have learned that we are the temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwells in us. That is the saved, those who are saved. Matthew 18 verse 20, Jesus says, for where two or three gather in my name, there I am with them. So when we meet, let's say I meet a brother or a sister in any place, and we talk about Jesus, the business of our meeting is about Jesus. We are praying, we are discussing Jesus, his work and everything. We recognize his presence, he will be there. That is important. We experience spiritual presence of God. Jesus upheld the basic permissible acts on Sabbath, but emphasized that preaching and ministering to the needs of the weak and vulnerable on the Sabbath are God's will too. And that on the Sabbath, Jesus made it clear that we should continue to do what we are supposed to do. Of course, rest from your routine work, and there should be holy convocation. You must participate. So when you read Luke chapter 4, you appreciate that Jesus actually went to the synagogue and met other believers to worship God. So the holy convocation is something that Jesus continued to promote. So this is what Jesus taught and practiced. Now let's look at what the apostles did when it comes to the Sabbath observance. We are looking at space for divine encounter, where to meet God. Now the apostles and the early church observed the Sabbath in places they considered conducive for praying. Now Jesus, the apostles, and the early church observed the Sabbath in the synagogues. Consistently, we see that in the New Testament. The disciples met in the temple daily and celebrated the Lord's Supper in their houses. So this is a point we need to note carefully. Now, sex and spiritual devotion is the next item that we want to emphasize. Here we're focusing on Pauline writing. The Church of Corinth asked Paul if it was good for a man to have sex with a woman. Now, Paul answered that it could be done only in marriage. He stressed that the husband and the wife should not deny each other the right to sexual intercourse. There was a debate in the Corinthian church as to whether sex was okay for believers to engage in, because Paul, their spiritual father, was celibate, and other apostles such as Peter and John had wives. So it was a concern for some of the church members. Paul plainly emphasized that sex in marriage was not sinful. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 36 says sex in marriage is not sinful, and that point is we have to know that. Though marriage with its mandatory sexual intercourse commitment is not sinful, when couples are devoted to prayers, they should cease having sex. This is what Paul says. Okay? And it's important to know. The question is why? Let's respond to that. And here, Paul's the one going to respond. We will not do the response for him because he makes his own case. First point is that Paul spoke within the context of a temporal devoted encounter with God. Temporal, not permanent, as required in the Old Testament cultic services. As we have laid out clearly in our Old Testament section, in our previous section, that certain rituals, for example, the Day of Atonement, required abstinence from anything pleasurable. So sex was one, food was one, anything pleasurable. And it's important to understand this, that I've given these references. As you read them, you appreciate that this was a clear teaching when it comes to engaging God, having an encounter with God, going to the temple and offering sacrifices for certain kinds of acts. one was required to abstain from any sensual fantasies. Now, Paul's advice parallels the Testament of Naphtali, chapter 8, verse 8, a document that was written during the intertestamental period. It's not classified as biblical, but it teaches the tradition or the beliefs of the Jews when it comes to one having an encounter with God. It reads, "There is a time for having intercourse with one's wife, and a time to abstain for the purpose of prayer." And that is very clear from this text. So the normal feeling among the Jews was that if one was praying, one could not, especially when one had to take some time off, like fasting, for some days, one had to abstain from anything sexual. Now, remember that 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 5 says that the husband and the wife will abstain from sexual intercourse in this hour of devotion. The words we read in verse 5b, in order that you might devote yourselves to prayer, in verse 5b, indicate a special religious time as opposed to any other prayer time. Paul is not advising against marital sexual intercourse before or after any other prayer. Instead, his advice is restricted to the mutual decision of the couple to devote some time to engaging God and deny themselves of any pleasurable acts and sensations. Indeed, his advice is restricted to the mutual decision of the couple to devote some time to engaging God and deny themselves of any pleasurable acts and sensations, meaning that the couple must decide that we are taking 2 days off the calendar to commune with God as a couple, and that during this time we are not going to have any sex. There must be that mutual understanding, and that a party cannot take a decision that he or she is going to spend some time with God and therefore is going to deny the other party need for sex. That is what Paul is speaking against, and that there must be a mutual understanding. This denial may be indicative of the value placed on the petition. It's important that nobody denies the other party the need for sex. We read from 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 6 that I say this as a concession. Paul is speaking, not as a command. So Paul is saying that, hey, married couples, if you decide to have sex whilst you are fasting, there's nothing wrong with it. Why? Because I'm not giving you any command. I'm only suggesting that for you to focus on what you are praying about, you must deny yourself of any sensual pleasure. And you don't need to really take this as a command. It's a concession, because if you really mean business, if you are praying for, let's say, a child, if you are praying for something that you feel that two of you need, then you must deny yourself of anything that gives you pleasure, food, sex, and anything that gives you pleasure. And so it's only a concession. It's only a suggestion I'm giving, and that is not a command. Meaning that there's nothing wrong even having sex whilst you are fasting. Because when you are praying, when you're not fasting, just praying over food, or before you sleep, before you go to work, before you do anything, once you have divine encounter, it's a divine encounter. It's not minimal. You don't have a particular encounter that is less significant, more significant. No. That's why Paul is saying that it's only a concession. It's a suggestion that I'm making so that you can focus on what you are doing. It is only to help you to focus on what you are praying about. It is not that it's a sin that when you have sex, you are committing a sin and therefore you can't encounter God, or you can't have time with God at the same time have sex. Paul is not saying that. Meaning that sex is not a sin, as he has already said in verse 5, and that when you are fasting, you can decide to either have it or not. In verse 6, by using this demonstrative pronoun, Paul emphasizes that his statement regarding abstinence is a concession, not a command. Therefore, a married couple can decide to abstain or not when they are in a devoted prayer mood. Because we commune with God all the time, within and without. We meditate, we go on our knees, we stand, as we walk, we talk to Him. And so prayer is a lifestyle that we should lead. And such a lifestyle should not prevent one from satisfying what nature or God has ordained as good for married couples. Conclusion: the New Testament church did not observe the laws of uncleanness because God's physical presence was not conditioned on their convocations or congregational meetings. The New Testament church met in houses and worshipped God in prayer, preaching, and singing hymns. God's spiritual presence is experienced as a saved. Therefore, the saved becomes the temple of God, and God dwells, His Spirit dwells in that person. That person, for the rest of the person's life, the person is a temple of God, praying, preaching, and praising God. God's spiritual presence is not found at only holy convocations, that when only God's people meet in one place, then God's presence is felt, but also at private moments of believers. Wherever a believer is, and a believer wants to connect, the presence of God can be realized. The fact that the believer is saved, the presence of God is with the believer. Wherever. Sanitizing your body after nocturnal emission, discharge, sexual intercourse, menstruation, childbearing, or touching a dead body, human bone, or grave will be healthy to participate in congregational worship on any day. We should not limit the uncleanness to only sexual intercourse. We shouldn't do that. And it is not the act or the day that makes one defile. In the New Testament, it is the practice of evil that causes defilement of the body. Because we have the spiritual presence of God. It's not a sexual intercourse. It's not menstruation. It's not childbearing. It's not touching a dead body. It's not touching a human bone or grave that causes defilement. It is the sin that we practice. The Spirit of God is in us, so once we practice any lawlessness, we are defiling the temple of God. This should be the focus. And that the defilement that is acquired through nocturnal emission, discharge, sexual intercourse, menstruation, childbearing, touching a dead body, human bone or grave, can be taken care of with just sanitizer. So that as we mingle with other believers, we will not infect them with any, transmissible diseases. Therefore, having sex on Sabbath hours does not defile a person. Going through a cemetery on the Sabbath as you walk to church will not defile you. If you're having your menstruation and you have actually taken care of yourself, nobody will feel or see or smell anything on your body. And going to church does not defile you and does not defile people gathered there. There's no defilement because God's physical presence, which requires ceremonial cleanliness for congregational meetings, is no longer applicable. We don't have the temple today. And as we said, it is not about the temple, it's about the presence of God. And now God is in us. Then the logical conclusion that one can arrive at is that, well, then we can't even have menstruation because God is in us. We can't give birth. If one wants to give birth, we become impure. And as long as you have given birth and you are still in your purification stage, the Spirit of God cannot be with you. God will leave your presence because you are defiled. That is not the teaching of the Bible. I pray that you understand this passage and that having sex on Sabbath hours does not defile a person.
Thank you for staying tuned and for spending your time with us as we went through this topic in 2 parts. We believe you have understood this presentation so well and that you'll be an ambassador of Bible Talk Class to share with the world. Thank you very much and stay tuned. Till we meet again. The kingdom restored to you shall begin. Come enter my joy, sit down on my throne. Bright crowns are in waiting. Hold fast till I